Thank you for clicking on this video. I really appreciate it. So, in today's video, I'll be covering Bjork. And I'll be covering her project, Utopia. So let's introduce Bjork and the album Utopia. Now we'll start with a super basic intro to Bjork if you don't know her. So Bjork is an Icelandic musician from Reykjavik. Her musical style is constantly changing, but she takes on inspiration from electronic, folk, pop, experimental, trip-hop, jazz, industrial, classical, and avant-garde music. The project I am covering today, Utopia, takes inspiration from avant-garde and folktronic music. So, Utopia's songs feature many lush soundscapes built from granular synths and airy flutes. But despite featuring lots of electronic sounds, Utopia keeps a very organic and alien, otherworldly sound. One of the reasons for Utopia's unique sound is because of the producer Arca, who Bjork collaborated with on almost every track. Together Arca and Bjork create these beautiful organic instrumentals filled with acoustic and electronic sounds. So, now that we have done a little intro, let's look deeper into the production choices of Utopia. But first, before we get started, you should check out my music. So, anyways, let's get started. So to begin, I needed to figure out how I would structure the song. Looking into the project, I noticed that it used a lot of unorthodox song structures. Unlike lots of modern music that uses the verse-chorus form, Utopia's songs tend to have unconventional song structures. So I wanted to incorporate a weird structure into the beat. So I experimented a lot with different formats, but I finally decided on this evolving song structure. So for this beat I made it evolve from an open and airy flute section to a more moody and atmospheric synth-heavy section. For the first section I was more inspired by the flute melodies on Utopia, and the second the atmosphere and synths on The Gate. So, in the intro here, I introduce the flutes, then, after the intro, the chorus of this section starts, where I add strings, synths, and drums. After the chorus, I transition into a bridge section. This bridge section is what connects their first and second parts of the song. The bridge then leads into the second part, where I add textured synths, bass, and recorded strings. So now that we have gone over the structure, let's go over there. So the melodies in Utopia are quite varied. For example, in Your Eyes and My Senses, we hear very open and lush cycling harp plucks that are paired with giant echoey synths, or on Sue Me, we hear what sounds like these deep reverbed vocal samples and distant synths and flutes, which play a cacophony of these uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing melodies, or the flute-heavy track Utopia, that features colorful flute passages and subtle string plucks. So, despite the instruments and melodies on Utopia being quite varied, we get a few constants, like the use of flutes in instrumentals, and the implementation of atmospheric and granular synths. So when making my melodies I took a lot of inspiration from two songs in particular, Utopia and The Gate, which I feel showed the strengths of both acoustic and synthetic sounds of the project. And finally, I use the VSTs, BBC Orchestra, Quanta 2, and Serum in this beat. Okay, so now let's take a look at the melodies. So I started the beat with just flute and strings. And I wanted to begin the song super simple. So I made this simple and spaced out melody with some flutes and strings. And I wanted to make the flutes very short and punchy, to make them jump out at you more. And here, I introduce the main melody a bar earlier, to make an easier transition into the chorus section. So taking a look at the MIDI, I have this first layer of flutes, which play these chords, and this very simple top line. The second layer is made up of these staccatoed flutes, which layer with the first flutes and brings a more airy and woody sounding texture, and also adds more punctuation to the chords. Then I have a cello pluck playing a very simple bass line. The cello fills out the low end and also adds more punch during each chord. Then I have this ascending line up which leads us into the main melody. So here is where the chorus section begins. During this section, I switch up the flute melodies, and introduce new instruments like multiple synth and string layers. So let's take a look at them. So in this section, the flute is playing the main melody. My inspiration for this melody was the short and colourful flutes on the track Utopia. So, for this melody, an important element I use is the contrast of note accents. The two accents I use are staccatoed and legatoed notes. The staccatoed notes add more punctuation, pop, and color to the melody, while the legatoed notes provide a more gentle, swelling feeling to contrast the more intense staccatoed notes. Additionally, the legatos have a swelling effect, which create a pull into the next measure. And if you look here, I automated the flute's volume to add more realistic dynamics, and that's what gives the flutes that swelling sound. And here is where I transition into a busier, messier set of melodies. These notes might sound a bit all over the place, but they follow a descending and ascending melody pattern. So here's the first flute layer, which plays both the short staccatoed notes and the longer swells. It also plays the melodies for the busier section too. Then I have a flute playing the bass notes. Then again in the second section the flute plays the low notes. And finally I added this staccato flute, which helps add more color and pop to the melody, and plays an ascending melody in between the swells. During the busy section it sits in the background more, and is used to add more punctuation to the notes. Then I added cello plucks which play on each flute hit and just play the bass note. Then I have this cello passage which adds more movement. Then I have this synth from Quanta that layers with the main melody. Then during the second passage I tucked it more in the background to fill up space and add ambience. Then similar to the first synth, this one comes in during the second passage and is used to add ambience. Then finally I have this flute sound that I made in FL Granulizer. Now we come to the bridge section, which is our transition from the first half to the second half of the song. In this section I remove the synths and strings and simplify the flute melodies. So let's take a look at them. So, after the busy section ended I transitioned into this slow-moving flute passage. To simplify the melodies, I stripped down the runs and made this sparsed-out chord progression. Then the flutes pick up momentum again here, which leads us into the second half of the song. So, the first layer of flutes are in charge of holding the notes out. Then I sprinkled in some of the bass flute into the bridge. Then the staccatoed flutes are in charge of adding punch to each chord. Finally, the last section is where I introduce recorded strings, and transition to a more synth-heavy melody. So I added all these synths with granular effects. And I slipped in this flute too. So I compiled all those synths into this gate-inspired pattern. And also drawing inspiration from the gate, I added this big bass sound hitting on every 4 bars too. And added an ascending synth lead also similar to the gate. And all those synths in the background give a nice textured feel to the pattern. So taking a look into the synth layers, I started out with this shiny and shimmery synth. And with a lot of these synths I don't try to make a melody, but instead I try to place the notes kind of randomly to bring a more chaotic energy. Then I have this synth scattered around for more ambience. And I added this super ambient synth too. Then I have this synth that plays a more structured melody. Then I have this little flute melody in there too. Then finally, this is the main melody of this section, which is made from this simple sine wave synth. Then I made multiple variations of the pattern with slightly different synth patterns. And finally, I have this last variation that concludes the song. And this repeating synth pattern ends off the song. So now that we have covered the melodies, let's go over there. So many of Utopia's instrumentals are a mix between acoustic and electronic sounds. In the album we primarily get flute and synth combos. But there are also many other instruments used on the album, like harp, violin, cello, bass, and voice. So I really wanted to incorporate some live flute playing into the beat, but since I don't have a flute I'm going to be using a recorder instead. Then I'm also going to incorporate some violin too, and I can pitch it down to sound like a cello. So here is what I made. So I recorded a bunch of recorder takes. Then I chopped them up and selected the parts I liked. Then I pitched down the recorder a couple semitones to fit the scale. And placed them throughout the track. Then I stitched together these recorder notes, which play a simple melody that pairs with the synths in this section. Also, on the recorder I added Valhalla Supermassive to get that chorusy sound. Then during the end of the track I introduced this new recorder melody. Next I recorded a lot of violins into the track. So, at the beginning of the track I play these plucks. Then I added these tremoloed violins. And on top are these violins playing the main melody of the first flute section. Then, I transition into a new set of melodies, which come in during the busy part of the flute section. And these violins help add to the chaotic and messy sound of this section. Then during the bridge I introduce these violin swells, which layer with the flute chords in the bridge. And these swells add a really cool atmosphere to the beat, and pair very nicely with the synths. Then right here I just doubled the swells to add more movement. And at the end here I switched up the pattern to add a variation and to indicate that the synth patterns are changing. Then I have this weird sound that I made from a violin that I use for transitions. I made this by taking a violin sample, and pitching it down and adding a granular effect and delay. Then during the second section I have these violins playing in the background. These are meant to fill up space in the beat and add some nice harmonies. So now that we have looked into all the melodic elements, let's go over there. So on Utopia we get a lot of different types of drum patterns. Like on Saint we get these deep, cycling, and slow-moving drums, and Losses is drums that are more glitchy, warped, and textured, or courtship that has detailed, clicky, and snappy drums. So for this beat I'm going to use more reverbed, simple, and spaced out drum patterns, more along the lines of Utopia, Saint, and Blissing Me. So for this beat I'm going to use So now let's take a look into the drums. First, I started out with this simple drum pattern. This pattern was inspired by Utopia's drums, where we get these spaced out and reverbed kicks and shakers. Then after the intro, I add in some kicks, and more shakers, which help add more movement and fill in the space between the impacts. Then I stripped back the drums before the busier section. Then I made this drum pattern for the busy section. And finally, during the second section of the beat, I added kicks, crashes, and shakers into this simple, repetitive pattern to sit in the background. After we have covered the drums, let's go over there. So Utopia has a very natural theme and atmosphere, so Bjork and Arco incorporate lots of nature sounds into tracks. These effects are used in multiple ways in the album, like being used to add background ambience which adds more immersion into the track, or also adding different textures to sounds. So here's the effects I'm using. So starting out, I placed some forest ambience and bird calls down. Then I had to use the bird call from Utopia. Fun fact, this bird call is from the species Montezuma oripendula from South America. Then I added some more unusual bird calls. Then added this walking through lead sound. Then, I have these wooden crash sounds that layer with the drum hits to add more texture. And I also have these leaf brush sounds and echoey word sounds. Then I have a few different patterns for each section, with slightly different sounds. Then finally, the last effect I added was this kick sample, which is also used for its texture, and I created this by using a granular effect, and placing OTT on top of it. Now, finally, for the last section let's cover there. To begin, I made this cinematic-based sound. So to make this you first want to start with a triangle wave. Adjust the fine tune to -64. And it sounds like this. Then shape the LFO for the transients, and adjust the rate. Then apply it to the coarse pitch, and turn it down to -37. And this adds punchiness to the bass. Now I'm going to shape the envelope. Apply a little low pass EQ, then I will add some effects, and rearrange them. Turn up the drive, turn up the gain and turn on multiband. And keep the chorus and delay on default. And here's the finished sound. Then to avoid overlap you can turn on mono. Next I made this simple ambient sine lead. So first pull up a sine wave. Adjust the envelope. And it sounds like this. Then add distortion, reverb, compression, chorus, and delay, rearrange the order, then turn up the gain and turn on multiband. Then turn up the delay. And this is the final sound. Next, I'm also using Quanta 2, a granular synth, for the ambient background synths. So first I made this airy plucky-like synth. The sample I used for this was this recorder note I played. So I dropped the sample into the synth. And first I applied some noise. Then turned down the grain density. and kept the grains at a shorter length. Then I turned the grain envelope to a sine to have a smoother sound. Then I drew out this envelope and added some delay. And this is the final sound. Next I made this warped voice-like synth, which I made from this violin note I played. So I applied a lot of noise. Then had a moderate amount of grains. And then I put a longer grain length to give a more ambient sound. And I have a smooth grain envelope. And the sample position is randomized and also automated by LFO. Then I have 2 filters on with automated cutoffs. Then finally I made this envelope. And that's how I made this synth. Then finally, I made these sounds by running some flute samples through Fruity Granulizer and Portal. So, I first started with these flute samples. Then I placed them in Fruity Granulizer, and selected the preset, Weird Language, which makes the flutes sound like this. Then I added Portal, and selected the preset, Light and Dark. And the final product sounds like this. Yay! So now we finally covered all the sections, so now let's hear the final beat.
Melodies.